this episode of Cost of Silence, the Day's managing editor, Karin Florin, speaks with Joe Wojtas, the current city editor and former staff writer who has covered the Diocese of Norwich sex abuse cases for over 20 years.
For many years, journalist Joe Wojtas has been following and covering the Norwich Diocese and its sexual abuse scandal. And we would like to talk a little bit, Joe, about how you got started and your experience covering this over the years.
About 25 years ago, I think it began. The Day had done a number of stories about lawsuits and sexual abuse allegations against priests in the Diocese of Norwich. And then about that time was the whole scandal up in Boston with the Archdiocese up there that became a book and became a movie. And also one of the reporters Tom Farragher used to be a reporter here at the Day on that team, the Spotlight team that investigated that. So it got me thinking, I wonder how our diocese handled this issue. So I spent probably 9 months, if I recall, looking into Bishop Riley, the former bishop here, and how he handled this issue in the diocese. Was a lot of looking at court records, talking to victims, that type of thing. It led to a story it was a front page story. It was on Mother's Day in some of the early 2000s that it ran front page on Sunday, and that story began. I remember, and I'd met Bishop Riley on a number of occasions. He was a really gregarious guy. The people loved him. I used to cover the Blessing of Fleet and Stone team. He'd be down there every year. He'd come over to me, talk to me, see if I needed any comments. He'd hug people and talk to people and joke around. And he was a really personable guy. And I started talking to people. And, he was known every year for some St. Patrick's Day celebration in Norwich, where he would go there and he'd sing Danny Boy to the crowd, and he was a big hit, and everybody loved the guy. I mean, but there was another, and this was part of the story. There's a whole nother part to Bishop Riley, and that was his involvement in knowingly transferring priests to other parishes after he knew that they had been accused of sexually assaulting young boys through the diocese, not just in Norwich, but in his previous assignments. We ran across court documents, and I interviewed victims from other parishes, and other places in New England. But there was particularly one, he was in charge of assigning priests in Rhode Island. And there was this one priest where they had transferred a couple times because of complaints about him and young boys. And in one summer, he transferred him to a summer camp down on the shore in Rhode Island, where he sexually assaulted a whole bunch of kids. And that was really kind of eye-opening to me. It was like, we didn't know about that. And so all this stuff was in this story that painted this picture of Bishop Riley's involvement in this issue. And we took a lot of heat for it. We got complaints, and people were going to cancel subscriptions and all that kind of stuff. Bishop Riley's he's still alive. He's retired. He's never agreed to an interview with me. And so that's how we get started on it anyway.
So during the course of your reporting, you successfully interviewed many victims and who also decided that it would be okay to identify themselves. And you told some pretty harrowing stories of what happened to them. Can you talk about what it was like contacting them, what your approach was like to get them to disclose their stories?
So I've been a reporter now for going on 40 years now. And these are some of the most emotional and memorable interviews I've ever done in my career. Because you're dealing with older men, guys in their 50s and 60s who are reduced to sobbing in front of you. I don't really know them, and they're crying their eyes out, trying to tell you not just what happened in graphic detail, and then also the effect it's had on their families, their lives, and things like that. And one of the first ones I did, and who's become a person I talk to often about these cases because he's kind of become a spokesman for the victims here in southeastern Connecticut, is Tim McGuire from New London. The first time I interviewed Tim, he told me his story. He was here in a small conference room of the day, and he was sobbing. He couldn't even get the words out. But my rule was you had to talk on the record. We weren't going to be unnamed sources. You had to tell me your name. We were going to use your name, even though it was very personal things. And afterwards he called me back. He said, "Look, I can't do this." He says, he has family members who he doesn't want to upset. He just wasn't ready for the public to know about his what happened to him. So 10 years later, he came back, called me one day, said, "I want to tell my story." And he came in and we did it, and we published a story about him. But I've interviewed people, these they have lots of substance abuse problems, a lot of mental illness problems. And another gentleman who lives over in the Clinton, Westbrook area, went to his apartment. He's all kinds of mental health issues from this. And I talked to him and his therapist one day, and his therapist talked to me a lot about his issues. And she also recounted when the current Bishop Cody in Norwich, came to visit them, actually agreed to a sit down. And she claims, promised to pay for this gentleman's mental health care. And then a couple weeks later, when she called to find out how the financial responsibility was going to happen, she could never get anybody to call her back. Stories like that. And one other one, this goes into the Mount St. John issue, which we're going to talk about, was a gentleman there who, from Australia, who was raped by this priest or a Christian brother that eventually came to Mount St. John here in Essex. And he's told me all the horrible nightmares he still has. And one of the things he told me, which is, this was a long phone call one night, was that in times in his life when happy things happen, and he was talking to me about a time he won a national bicycling race, and he was driving home through the middle of nowhere in Australia. It was pitch dark out. With his family, suddenly he gets transported back to running away from this priest and trying to hide in an outhouse one day, where he hid for hours while the guy was looking for him because he thought he was going to get sexually assaulted. And suddenly he finds himself in these places, like he's really there again. The nightmares, and one gentleman telling me about how he has nightmares where the priest's hands are chasing him. So there's really pretty emotional stuff that these guys have gone through over the years.
Before we do move on to the Mount St. John, Joe, did the interviews eventually show a pattern of how these children were approached or groomed, and how it was then covered up?
They do. They a lot of these people came, not all of them, but single parent families. Some of them not. They had 2-parent families. Seemed to be from pretty stable families, but a lot of them never told anybody because, one, of things, their families were friends with the priest, or two, their parents were very religious, mothers, fathers, and they didn't tell anybody until their parents died. They didn't want to tell them. They didn't know how their parents would react to them. And so they just kept it bottled up. And the studies show, and there's an expert from the University of Pennsylvania who studied this extensively, that the average victim who's assaulted in this context waits to age 52 to tell anybody, whether that's a spouse, a friend. So they go their whole lives pretty much keeping this inside before they actually end up telling anybody. Interesting thing about age 52 is that it's several years past the age in Connecticut in which you can file a lawsuit. So if you wait to 52, you can't file a lawsuit. So that's another issue for these people as well.
So, in the case of the brother that was transferred from Australia, I
Correct.
think you said?
Yeah, Australia.
So back in Australia, it was somehow known that he had been abusive towards children.
Oh, it's known. We have some minutes from a meeting there where they talk about the problems that he's having, and still they got a request from the Bishop of Norwich, from Bishop Riley, to bring him all the way across the world to a boys' school in Deep River. The diocese has never talked about. They won't answer why they brought him here. And did they know? But he had been accused there, and the diocese there had got him some help or counseling for his issues there. So it was well known when they brought him here what they were getting.
What is Mount St. John? What kind of school is it? And did you go there during your reporting?
I haven't actually been there because it's closed. But it's a school for what I guess euphemistically called troubled youth, kids who get in trouble with the law, and then when they went through the juvenile court system, they were sent there to go to school and to get counseling. A lot of these kids came from broken homes, from the cities, in some of Connecticut cities, and they would end up at this place.
So the children were somehow already vulnerable.
Yes. Oh, yeah. These kids had already had some pretty horrific home lives, I think, already before they ever got there. Yeah.
I think you were telling me a story the other night of one particular kid who was so traumatized at home that this was the only...
They've been sexually assaulted back home. From what I call, there's something like 65 or 70 lawsuits here. I've read every single one of them, and some of them are even worse than others. But I remember one of the victims saying that he was threatened with that if he told anybody about the sexual abuse, he would be sent back to his family where he had been sexually abused to begin with. So, so there's there's stories like that. And the Mount St. John thing involved this Christian brother and another Christian brother, Paul McGlade was the main person here, but there was another brother, and then there was other staff members too. And the court documents show that these student kids, they're teenage boys, that they told people about what was going on when it was there, and evidently nothing was ever done. So
a Christian brother, by the way, is somebody who is he studying to become a priest?
No, he's in this order. He's a Christian. He's not a priest.
Okay.
But there's Christian brothers all around the world. There's various entities of them. Yeah.
And it was the incidents at Mount St. John that have largely led to the huge sort of downfall now at the diocese, where they've declared bankruptcy.
Right, because most of these lawsuits in the past that the diocese has settled have gone in the $1 million+ range. So if they had to settle all these out of Mount St. John, we're talking $60-70 million. And it's money that the diocese says it doesn't have. So they're, in order to continue operating and not have to sell every last thing they had, they decided that declaring bankruptcy would be the only way, and I can't speak for them, but this is the only way that they could stay solvent, and as they said, ensure that people got some money. The diocese says this is a fair and equitable way to distribute money to everybody, because otherwise it'd be the first person who sued and got their case through the courts that would get money, and then pretty soon there'd be no money for anybody else. By the way, did any of the laws change in Connecticut or elsewhere as a result? Since I've been reporting this, they did two things. They established a task force to look at this issue, and they moved the age that you can file a lawsuit from 48 to 51, I think, 51. But that still leaves a lot of these people out in the, they can't file anyway, because they only moved it 3 years. What the task force had recommended on several occasions, they've recommended and tried to introduce a bill on several occasions, is that we do what New York, New Jersey, and other states have done. We establish a one-time window of about a year or two where a victim of any age can file a lawsuit. That's never been able to get out of committee up there. There's the Catholic Church, obviously, and other entities have lobbied against this pretty hard to get it out of committee, not let it get a vote, because it would result in massive, a lot of lawsuits and possibly bankruptcy for all the dioceses and other organizations. I'm not saying they're teachers and Boy Scouts and other things too, but this would be devastating to the church if they allowed a one-time window like this. And on the diocese end of it, and their supporters have said, well, if we let these older folks, lots of time have gone by. There's no witnesses. The defendants are dead. So it's hard to prove or what these victims are claiming happened. So there's been, so far, it hasn't gone anywhere for a number of years now.
In addition to covering hearings and bills up in Hartford, you have closely followed legal proceedings for many years. Have you forged relationships with certain attorneys and firms that covered a lot of these cases? Did it get easier to read these filings because you were familiar with the material? What did they look like?
Well, it never gets easier to read the filings, because every time I think I've heard the worst story or the most horrific allegation, I hear another one. And some of them we've never been able to report just because they're so extremely graphic that we just can't put these in the newspaper. I mean, we might categorize them euphemistically, but there's some things that some of these victims have told me that I've never reported. We just couldn't. But yeah, I've developed, you develop relationships with any source. When I covered the town of Stonington, I developed sources, but especially, Kelly Reardon, attorney here in New London, handles a lot of this, and her father, Bob, have handled a lot of these cases over the year. And they're always, they've often, they'll speak publicly about their cases. So, and then I've interviewed a lot of these victims about this as well. So, I frequently talk to them. And then the SNAP, which is the Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests, the Connecticut chapter, they've been helpful too with our reporting, because they keep track of this. And every story we reach out to the diocese, but they have not, for years, have not wanted to talk about this issue with us.
What do the complaints, besides the allegations that they list, what do they allege? Is it negligence, or usually these civil lawsuits?
You mean, the civil lawsuits?
Yeah.
Sure. That the diocese knew that this was going on, that they didn't do anything to stop it, that they promoted an atmosphere that allowed it to happen, that they transferred priests, that they knew this was going on. They're pretty much, you just read the same thing, and they're pretty much almost boilerplate when you read a lot of these lawsuits. The only things that are different are the actual circumstances of the abuse, which is different.
Okay. And again, you wrote about many of them that were settled for 6 figures, 7 figures, $1 million or more, right? Yeah. And then are there a lot pending right now, and what will happen with them as a result of this bankruptcy?
So there's not all the Mount St. John's ones are pending. So once the diocese filed for bankruptcy, they couldn't be sued, and all the other lawsuits, it froze any lawsuits. So if as part of this bankruptcy, the victims agree to the settlement numbers, they have to withdraw. All their lawsuits cannot proceed. They'll withdraw all their lawsuits. So it makes all the lawsuits go away. Diocese can never be sued again on this issue. So if you're going to come forward now, you're out of luck. You can't sue. Also, the other thing that it's interesting is the individual churches are individual corporations. So they could still be sued. The diocese now has protection. They don't. So the person, a victim, could sue them. And what if they had a number of cases and they're $1 million each? These little parishes couldn't afford $10 million or whatever it could be, or $12 million or whatever. So what they decided to do was join the bankruptcy. By joining the bankruptcy and paying into the bankruptcy, 51 or 52 parishes contributed a total of $2.5 million. They now have protection against lawsuits. They can't be sued either. So that they were kind of forced there to do that, because otherwise they had so much outstanding liability that it might have been very disastrous for their parish.
And Joe, because you are such a thorough journalist, you always did your due diligence and contacted the diocese whenever you were about to report something or as you were reporting something. Can you talk about how they responded to these inquiries, and sort of in general what their approach to this tremendous scandal was?
Most of the time they just don't respond at all. So that's almost been all of the time. They just don't respond, or they have hired a public relations firm now to speak on this. And when the bankruptcy info was released 2 weeks ago, I reached out to them with a bunch of questions. They immediately told me the Diocese of Norwich wouldn't have any comment, answer any questions. But of course, I have to ask the questions because I had a lot of questions, and I requested an interview with the bishop. And I also had a bunch of questions. They never responded at all. That's typically the way they've responded over the years. I do have to say the bishop did agree to an interview one day. He gave me a half an hour.
Bishop Cody.
Bishop Cody, the current bishop. And I went up there and spoke to him. And then Father Perkins, who's the pastor he was the vicar of priests at the time, and he was sitting at the meeting. And I know Father Perkins really well because I've interviewed him numerous times over the years about his church having to be rebuilt in Pawcatuck, and so it's interesting. I know him outside of this issue on a lot of other things. So he sat in too, and one of the questions, and I'll never forget this, is I said to Bishop Cody, well, there's all this information that Bishop Riley transferred priests who had been accused of abuse. And he said, well, I don't have any evidence of that. And I said, well, there's lots of evidence in it in the court records in the state of Connecticut, where there's depositions and there's testimony and lawsuits there that shows that he did that. I said, couldn't you report him? He said, to the Vatican, that he did this. And he said, well, I have no control over my fellow bishops. And I said, but you still couldn't report him. And obviously we weren't going to go anywhere on that question because he just said, he wasn't going to do it. He didn't have any way to do that. And that's the last time I was the one and only time he agreed to talk to me on this issue. And I tried to cover a lot of issues that day with him, but.
So in other words, most of these bad acts, I suppose, took place under the authority of the previous bishop or another bishop.
Correct. There's no evidence that any of these took place under Bishop Cody. They made an effort, I would say a pretty good effort, actually. Right. So Bishop Hart was the bishop between current Bishop Cody and Bishop Riley. And there was a case that we wrote about where Bishop Hart became aware of a sexual assault. In the state of Connecticut, as a mandated reporter, which the clergy is, Bishop Hart, if he didn't report it, the state could prosecute him for not reporting it. And you have a 1-year statute of limitations. A couple months after it happened, we reported that Bishop Hart became aware of it. He actually admitted that he knew about it, but he didn't report it. But no one ever prosecuted him. The police department, it was on the front page of our paper. The police department, the state's attorney's office in New London, no one ever even went near it. No one tried to prosecute him. This is the law for teachers where something happens in a school setting. And within a 1-year statute of limitations, the problem is often we don't find out about it until after a year. Nobody can prosecute it. So the statute of limitations is really short on this.
So this whole shame around it and secrecy around it, somehow the abusive priests were identified within their own schools or camps or whatever, right? Somehow it bubbled to the surface.
Oh, sure.
Even if the victims didn't tell themselves. How did it get out, Joe?
A lot of it came out later on in years. The church knew about it because they have files. And if you talk to Bob Reardon, the attorney from New London, he'll tell you that the church has a giant file in the Vatican of all this stuff. He's always says that they should have prosecuted under RICO Act, which is the corrupt, organized crime that they used on the mafia and the Latin kings and all these other, because they've run this corrupt organization over the years. But the church knew because they were getting reports. They were sending priests to counseling. They were transferring. And of course the victims knew. So it's been out there. But specifically here, and I think this is what you're getting in the Diocese of Norwich, after a lot of the reporting I did, they decided to release a list of credibly accused priests. And it came out, I can't remember the name, it was like in the 40s someplace that they had evidence. The list didn't tell us a lot. It didn't tell us like if they were dead or alive. It didn't tell us what the priest did. It didn't even tell us like what different parishes they served in. So we had to kind of fill in the holes. A lot of the priests I knew about, and some of them I didn't know about. And then there was priests I knew about who weren't on the list, which I'd interviewed victims who said, what about so-and-so? And they weren't on the list. So the list at best was incomplete. And then they decided to do a further investigation after that, an overall investigation. They hired an investigator who's done this in other places to get a clear picture of everything that happened in the diocese. But once they declared bankruptcy, they ceased that investigation, never published a report, never released a report or anything.
And of course, they're not subject to the Freedom of Information Act.
No.
You did this reporting sort of blindly, right? Because you cannot force them to release information.
Oh, no. You have to rely on talking to victims, looking in court records, documents and things like that. Yeah, lawsuits and lawyers and that type of thing.
So at some point, that list of credible abusers, what was the purpose of that?
I think they just wanted to, and I can't speak for them, but I think there've been so much reporting that we've done. I think they wanted to try to get information out to their parishioners and things about, this is what we're going to be open and honest and tell you about all these priests. And this is what happened.
So that's really actually a huge, milestone.
Well, it was a big step on their part because they've never even gone anywhere close to doing that in the past. And here's our list. But like I said, the list was incomplete at best. Yeah. But it was hard to get them to define why they would leave people off. Then they actually put somebody on there who wasn't supposed to be on there, so that became an issue. So there was enough, because we went through it and analyzed it and wrote about it, what the issues were with it.
At some point, I think the Vatican itself released sort of step-by-step how we're going to handle this, right?
They have protocols now about how they're going to handle it. And we've heard nothing. We've heard no complaints or issues or things that happened over the last maybe the last decade or so. I mean, there hasn't, I haven't got anybody saying this happened here or this happened there. So they've tried to be a job with, investigating people or like bringing it to the forefront. But there hasn't been a lot since then. So,
okay.
But a lot of these people, these victims now are in their 50s and 60s and 40s, or in the case of the Mount St. John young men in their 30s. So we have lots of people today who are alive who are between 30 and 80 who were victims, and they're still alive and living with this issue every day.
Joe, anything else that you wanted to say before we move on?
No, just that, this is one of these issues that, not myself, but the day in general, this is why you need a local newspaper. And the importance of a local newspaper is because this reporting would never have been done without a good, strong local newspaper and the reporters and editors to handle it. So all around the country, this is issues happen all around the country, everywhere. Every single diocese has this issue. And if you look around and see the reporting on it, it's in big cities, but a lot of these other places, have never done, this kind of reporting doesn't get done.
If you or someone you know has been a victim of sexual abuse or assault, you can contact the Survivors Network of those abused by priests at 877-SNAP-HEALS. That's 877-762-7432. You can also contact the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network at 800-656-4673 and the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 800-799-7233. Cost of Silence is a production of The Day. Production, editing, and music by me, Carlos Virgen. It is co-produced by Karin Florin and Joe Wojtas. The series relies on the extensive reporting done by Joe Wojtas, staff writer and editor at The Day. The Day's executive editor is Izaskun Larrañeta, and our managing editor is Karin Florin.